and welcome to Always Take Notes.
A message from our sponsor, Arvon. Do you have a story in you, or want to test the waters of writing poetry or non-fiction? Maybe you already write, and write well, but would like to try a new form or genre, pick up some new tricks.
Enter Arvon. Arvon runs a yearly programme of in-person and online events, from 5-day residential writing weeks that take place at one of their 3 writing houses, to a flexible online programme featuring 5-week online evening courses, masterclasses, and pay-what-you-can events. Arvon's courses cover everything from commercial, genre, and experimental fiction to poetry, screenwriting, and even songwriting.
They've been running creative writing courses up and down the UK since 1968. In that time, their prize-winning tutors, many of whom may be some of your favourite writers, have unlocked the creativity of over 100,000 people. Many have gone on to be published authors and career writers themselves.
But actually, it's not about that. Writing with Arvon is about finding a supportive community of fellow writers, making like-minded connections that last a lifetime. By signing up for a course, you don't just get an acclaimed author as your tutor, you also gain a writing group to bounce ideas off long after the course is finished.
So whether it's a cosy stay at one of their writing houses in Devon, West Yorkshire or sleepy Shropshire, or a course you can do from the comfort of your sofa, Arvon works around your creative life.
Visit arvon.org/courses, that's arvon.org/courses, to learn more and give yourself the gift of writing. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak to the novelist and travel writer, Paul Theroux.
We spoke to Paul about building a career as both a travel writer and a novelist, about his relationship with V.S. Naipaul, and about his new novel, Burma Saab.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it.
Paul, welcome to Always Take Notes. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. We wanted to start with the new novel, Burma Saab, about George Orwell's experiences as a young man, a colonial police officer in Burma. And an interesting point reading some of the other coverage of it was this idea that this is a period of George Orwell's life that is not that well documented, that it's in some ways that, there's less written evidence on what he was reading, what was going on for him, perhaps particularly intellectually, than maybe some other periods of his life. Was that a reason why you were attracted for this period as a novel or as a piece of fiction?
Yes, that's one of the reasons. The shortest chapter in any Orwell biography is when Eric Blair goes to Burma. There are no letters home, there's no diary. There are a few fragments, a few poems that he wrote, one about a visit to a prostitute. Then there are allusions in his work in Homage to Catalonia, Road to Wigan Pier, there are little allusions. So that's very tempting. If you have a lot of information, it's very hard to write a good novel. What you want are a few tantalizing details. A donné, as Henry James called it. So someone tells you a story, and often I'm in the position of saying, don't tell me any more. I'll finish this story, I'll tell it. That was one thing. So this small amount of information, the fact that it's Burma, the fact that he's 19 years old when he goes, the fact that he didn't go to university, he didn't go to Oxford like his schoolmates, Cyril Connolly and the others. The other is, when I was roughly his age, when I was 20, 21, I went to Central Africa and I was completely out of my element. So this was 1963. I went to the British territory of Nyasaland. And that was how my life really started. It started as a man, it started as a writer, it started as a teacher. It just was my introduction to the world. And I know that happened to Orwell. So the epigraph to the book is there's a short period in everyone's life when his character is fixed forever. And that happened to me in Africa. And I'd always wanted to write about that in a kind of parallel way with Orwell, because I understood what happened to Orwell. It was the same thing that happened to me. I lived in a very repressed period, culturally. I grew up near Boston, Massachusetts. I never really had a girlfriend. I never had an adventure. I didn't have a lot of money. I tended to work on the weekends instead of going to football games or something like that. So my life started when I left. I mean, I went from there, my hometown, to Central Africa. And I learned the language. I made friends. I was a teacher. I ultimately became headmaster of the school, of this little bush school. And I could understand what had happened to Eric Blair, how he became George Orwell, in fact. For one thing, he had a lot of mates. He made friends. He had the great availability of sexual adventures. This happens when his were mainly prostitutes. I won't go into detail about mine, but suddenly my life expanded. I thought I had great freedom, great sexual freedom, freedom to travel, freedom to kind of expand my mind as a teacher. And so I could relate to that. The other thing, very important, was the Union Jack was flying over my school, as it was over his police station. So I was in Nyasaland 7 months before it became the Republic of Malawi. So I had the great fortune to live in what was essentially a British colony. It was a territory, actually, but it was British people, mainly Scottish people, because it had been visited by David Livingstone, and the missions there were staffed by Scottish people. So I was able to use this experience, and I could relate to what happened. It was suddenly an awakening of his mind. There's also a lot of difficulties. I mean, he didn't like his job. I liked my job. I liked being a teacher. He hated being a policeman, understandably enough. But that's what drew me to it.
I saw you describe it as a reconstructed amphora, finding fragments of his life and setting them into clay. What were some of the fragments that you wanted to keep? Or was it just the ones that were available? And what did your clay look like, so to speak?
Well, the fragments are amazing, actually, because and they're dotted through Orwell's work. In one instance, it just as an aside, he talks about an American missionary and says, the missionary looks at him arresting someone and says, "I wouldn't want to have your job." And then Orwell writes, "So that's the kind of job I had. The kind of job that a cock virgin Midwestern missionary despises." That tells you a lot of things. First, he was in the company of American missionaries. That's very helpful. The fact that he not only arrested someone, but was bullying him. He talks about how he's bullying this guy. And then there's this tension and this conflict. I built a whole chapter about Blair and this missionary. I invented the missionary, but the missionary was there. They had American missionaries, Baptist missionaries, trying to convert Buddhists to Christianity. So there's a little fragment. I wouldn't want to have your job. Then there's other things. Shooting the elephant is a whole essay about how and why he shot this elephant. But there's much more to know. First, the elephant's very valuable. He's in Moulmein. His relatives lived in Moulmein. He never talked about them. But we know that, he never talked about visiting them. But he knows that he was in Moulmein, that his grandmother was there, very elderly. His uncle was there. His uncle had married a Burmese woman and had a child. Another uncle, a great uncle, had married an Indian woman. Their child, Amy, was there, half Indian. So half Burmese, half Indian. So just with that, the elephant, so he's shooting an elephant in Moulmein, we know that, because he wrote about it. But also, he's being witnessed by relatives. So his relatives would have been humiliated by the idea that their cousin has just shot an elephant and disgraced himself. So think what you could do with that. First, who owned the elephant? He finds out that the elephant is owned by a particular person. He meets someone who, it's an Indian who feeds the elephants. And you can, I won't say it's easy or simple, but it's very intense in the way that you can gather information, imagine the circumstances, and make something of that. So it's not just shooting an elephant, it's shooting an elephant, but witnessed by a lot of people, and also that this resonates with a lot of different people there who we know were in Moulmein. As a biographer works with facts, a novelist works with suppositions, imagined situations. And so when you only have a few facts, but a lot of possibilities, then you're able to build from that. So I described how these are fragments, like a Greek vase, as you mentioned. I described it. And I'm able to flesh them out. Where did it happen? Why did it happen? What were the consequences of it? So that's what a novelist does. usually a novelist does with an imagined character. I had the basis of a character, which is a young, untested, very young, untested, but well-educated. He went to Eton, very tall, very nervous, very anxious, doing a job that he hated. A policeman. I mean, here's a young English boy just out of school with a gun and a truncheon and a uniform and servants and a maid that he sleeps with. You know, think of the possibilities. So this occupied me for 2 very, very happy years. I mean, I finished it a little less than a year ago. And I must say I really enjoyed doing it. Biographers don't like to speculate. So one of his biographers actually reviewed the book. He gave it a good review, but a kind of grudging review, because I was saying things that he couldn't say. But if Orwell writes a poem about a very sweet Burmese woman to whom he offers 20 rupees to sleep with her, and she smiles and bats her eyes and says, no, 25, and that's a poem, you know that Orwell, had that experience. He's not writing about some imagined thing. He loved Rudyard Kipling, and that's kind of a Kipling poem. His poems weren't published, but like a lot of young men, like me. So when I was in Africa, I didn't write novels. I mean, eventually I did write one, but when I was in Nyasaland, Malawi, I wrote poems. Didn't publish them, but I wrote them. You know, that's what young people do. They write a poem.
I was listening to an interview or a discussion today that suggested that Orwell's reputation took a bit of a dive at the end of the Cold War because the Soviet threat had evaporated, but that now in an environment of kind of increased censoriousness, albeit perhaps for different reasons, people are reading and discussing and thinking about Orwell again. I mean, why do you think he has such magnetism still, and why is he still so widely read and discussed and fascinating for people, for yourself, but also for so many other people?
Well, first take the dip in his reputation, which I can say quickly. He was very anti-communist. I mean, as anti-communist as you can possibly be. Anti-Stalinist. He hated the Soviet Union. He wrote a piece about Hitler, and he said Hitler was kind of a comical character, kind of a sad, dog-like face. He said, you know, there's something deeply appealing about Hitler. He was reviewing Mein Kampf, but he hated the Soviet Union, so he took a dip. And also, before he died, he furnished the CID, the British intelligence, with a list of suspected communists. If you look online, you can see, why did Orwell out these people? They were pinks. He shot as pink, you know, suspected. So he kind of outed them, and he took some heat from that. Why he's in favor now is 2 reasons. One is people don't really read him. That Orwellian, when people say Orwellian, they don't know what they're saying. It's something to do with the future, with surveillance, with lack of freedom, with, freedom of speech or lack of it. People don't really know Orwell because Orwell had a lot of contradictions. For one thing, he didn't think that India was ready for independence. He didn't think Burma was ready for independence. Imagine, in 1943, Orwell is saying India should stay as a part of the empire. Well, no one alludes to that. They don't know that what Orwell actually said was, if freedom means anything at all, it means the freedom to say things that people object to. And that's a very unpopular position today, certainly in the United States. I'll give you an example with this book. Both in Britain and the States, I was urged to change various aspects of the book. They thought it was a bit too much, like certain words, certain attitudes. I don't want to go into detail because in the end I said no, but I got a lot of heat. Why? Because in this present climate, you can't say things that people object to. There are restrictions on all sorts of speech today. Now, Orwell was against those restrictions. So people who are talking about Orwell as a champion of free speech are also those people who are saying, you can't use this word, you can't say this, that's a bad attitude, that's cultural appropriation, or whatever it is, whatever it is. It's all bullshit. It's all bullshit. And I got some reviews that alluded to that. But actually, the reason why Orwell is popular is because, as I said earlier, I don't think they really know who he really was or what he really stood for. There's a certain image of who Orwell was, but it's not the man. He was very contradictory, and in some ways very conservative. Conservative about the empire. I mean, there's a guy who was anti-colonial, and he became anti-colonial because he was in Burma, and he's saying Burma shouldn't get independence in 1943, India shouldn't get independence in 1948. I mean, that's amazing. He also said Gandhi is a kind of Rasputin. I use that in my book. Gandhi, Gandhi, the hero, saintly Gandhi, he said he's like Rasputin. And he didn't say that when he was in Burma. He said it in the 1940s. So he's also having a moment because his books are out of copyright. You could quote Orwell liberally. I mean, I did. I cannibalized his book, Burmese Days. Why? Because it's out of copyright. It's anyone's property. Anyone can publish it, anyone can use it. And when a book's out of copyright, it's flying in the four winds. Anyone can seize on it. Anyone can quote it. As a matter of fact, a little bit of his work is still in copyright, and I had to pay to use it. But in general, when someone's out of copyright, it's free. I do think that he's misunderstood, though. I think that he's not really known. And he's a much stranger, much more eccentric, much more contradictory figure than he's given credit for.
We will come back to the new novel and Orwell later on, but can we roll back to the start of your writing career now? You've mentioned your time in the Peace Corps and as a teacher. How did you then start writing and producing novels?
I started wanting to be a doctor, and so I was a medical student. I studied pre-med when I was at university. I was a science student, and I studied, entomology and embryology, organic chemistry, and along with that, I was a great reader. I started life in a large family, needing privacy, and you find privacy in a book. You find freedom in a book. So I was always sitting in the library. I mean, I didn't actually buy a book till I was about 18 or 19 years old. I didn't have any money, but I used the library a lot. So I read, and I usually read books about travel to Africa, travel to South America, adventure books, books that tested skills, people freezing to death or in the desert or whatever. And reading turned me into a traveler. And travel helped me become a writer. But even when I was a medical student, I was writing. And I always took comfort in the fact that Chekhov was a doctor, Somerset Maugham was a doctor, lots of Voltaire was a doctor. There were plenty of writers who were also medical men. An American poet, William Carlos Williams, was an obstetrician. So I thought, well, this is great. I always thought, I'll go to Africa, I'll be a doctor, I'll do tropical medicine. I joined the Peace Corps because I didn't want to go to Vietnam. I was trying to avoid getting killed or becoming, involved in that war. So I went away, far, far away. And I suppose the combination of a new place, new scenes, the idea that I was involved in a place that was as strange as the moon. I had no idea of what Central Africa was like. And I could say it's nothing like it is today. It was barefoot people, mud huts, no roads. Before independence, the country had nothing. They had no schools. They had very few schools. I'll give some credit. There were a couple of good schools, but very few. There weren't very few secondary schools. It was a poor country. Nyasaland was poor. They produced tea, mainly, groundnuts, peanuts, and, not much else. They still are very poor. The stark vision of what I was looking at, of these people in this place I had no knowledge of, was so striking to me. I thought, what do you do with it? What do you do with this experience? Well, obviously you write about it. So although I was working on a novel in a kind of desultory way when I was there, Africa actually turned me into a serious writer. And I began to do journalism. I wrote poems. And then you don't come back from that. I became very committed to it. because I got a lot of pleasure from it. And, people complain about, writing is so difficult. Oh, the blank page. I never had that. I never had writer's block. I should knock on wood, but I'm an old guy. People probably wish I had writer's block. I published 56 book, 30 novels. Please, Paul, have writer's block. But I didn't. Anyway, I haven't had that problem. I've always had more experience, more things to write about than I've had time to write it. And also, if you come from a large family, of rivals, a family of very conflicted sibling rivalry, and there's favorites, and I was not a favorite. And you want somehow to distinguish yourself. Orwell talks about this. In Why I Write. He wrote an essay called Why I Write, and he talks about all the selfish reasons, the conceited reasons, wanting to distinguish yourself. Orwell, you think Orwell's saintly man. Well, he had an ego too, and I did. So coming from a large family, I thought, first I got to get out of this family, and secondly, I would like to do something to distinguish myself in some way or another. And a writer is an individual. Any writer, man or woman, when they write, you're not like any other writer. If you're a good writer, your writing is incomparable. There's no competition in writing. I'm not competing with any other writers. My books are sui generis, I think, as all writers are. That, in a nutshell, is why it happened. But why do you keep writing? Well, first is I hated having a boss. I hated showing up at staff meeting. That was a teacher. I wanted to be free. It's a wonderful profession. And I mean, in my case, very well rewarded, because early books of mine did very well. I had bestsellers, books made into movies. I loved it and still love it. I'm still writing, so that's the proof, right?
We wanted to ask about money in due course. We always ask everyone about that. But I had a question about the role of Uganda in your career, and particularly Makerere. Obviously, this is where you met V.S. Naipaul. And it was interesting to me because my great-grandparents both taught there. I think before you, they were there in the 40s, and my great-grandmother set up the art school there. But tell us about how you ended up in Kampala and then meeting Naipaul and the role that played.
Well, first let me ask you about your grandmother. Was she called Margaret?
Trowell. Yeah, Margaret Trowell.
Margaret Trowell, okay.
Yeah.
Margaret Trowell. The art school was called the Margaret Trowell School of Art.
It still is.
And, or it still is. And two of my best friends were there. Michael Adams, painter, lives in the Seychelles, and a guy called Jonathan Kingdon. Michael Adams is collected, his paintings are great. Jonathan Kingdon is a wonderful writer and also painter. And there were two of my buddies there at the Margaret Trowell. So God bless you and your grandmother.
Great-grandmother, I'd say, but yeah.
Great-grandmother.
But go back to your meeting with Naipaul and
Okay, so I was expelled from Malawi in 1965. Expelled, it's a long story, but basically I was involved in a plot to assassinate the Prime Minister. I was not aware of what the ultimate objective was, but I was helping a lot of former ministers who became guerrilla fighters. And I met them in Dar es Salaam, and it's a long, complicated, sad story, but it was the making of me, because what happened was, after I was expelled and sent to Washington to be interrogated, I said to these guys, you got to help me. So they said, we're going to help you. I said, if you don't help me, I'm going to be sent to Vietnam. So they said, we're going to get you a job at Makerere as a professor of English. I worked in the extramural department. I was there, that was 65. Pure fluke. Went to Makerere as my reward for helping this failed plot. And a few months later, I met Naipaul. Well, I heard Naipaul was coming. I only had only read one of his books, which was An Area of Darkness, about India. So I went to the bookstore. They had bought his books. He had published about 5 books by then. 3 novels, book of short stories, 2 travel books, The Middle Passage, Area of Darkness. I bought them all and loved them. I mean, I really loved them. I thought, this guy's a real writer. And I even talked to other people. I said, Naipaul's coming. Amazing, huh? Yeah, I said, yeah, he's coming. Not a great lot of enthusiasm. He was seen as a West Indian. He was seen as kind of a difficult person. So I met him, and I said, I love your work. And he said, it was at a party, and he was in a very bad mood. And he said, what do you like about it? And I said, your books about the West Indies, your travel. He said, what in particular? What? Tell me what? And he kind of interrogated me, put me on the spot. Well, I was able to answer all his questions. He was fairly impressed that I had read them. Not only read them, but I read all of them and could answer his questions. No one else at the university made that effort. And I asked him to sign them. He refused to sign the books because he was saying something like, well, if I sign them, they're just going to be more valuable, and you'll have something of value. I'm giving you something. I don't want to give you this. But he was impressed by the fact that I could speak Swahili, that I had a car, and I had friends. So I became his driver and his friend. And then he said, show me something you've written. So I showed him an essay that I was writing about, it was an anti-Vietnam thing. And he liked it, and he sort of helped me in that way. Then we became not friends, because he really didn't, he was like the impossible friend. He was possibly the most difficult, cantankerous person I've ever known in my life. I realized later he was depressive, and probably manic depressive, and really angry, and he could be very insulting too to people. I mean, he was asked to judge a literary competition. He refused to talk to students. He was reading these poems, and he said, well, all these poems are bad, so I'm not going to award the first or second prize. I'm going to award the third prize. So the third prize goes to this poem, and there's no first and no second prize. Well, the people, of course, are all insulted by it. And I thought that was hilarious. The fact that he was being consciously so difficult with people. And there are numerous instances. I mean, he refused to say Ghana. He said, well, you're from the Gold Coast, aren't you? And the guy, you're from Ghana. You're saying, well, Gold Coast is the colonial name. No, I'm from, well, Gold Coast. Yes, well. So he, trying to annoy people. He was actually very uncomfortable there. He was afraid of Africans, actually. And he was very timid traveling. So I became his go-to guy. I drove to Nairobi once, and he put it in a book. Not me, but the trip. It's in a free state. The trip that the guy takes in a free state, which won the Booker Prize, was a trip that we took. The things that we saw, people on the road, the incidents on the road. He also liked the thing I wrote. When I say like, he said something like, I think you have something. You see something. You can. And he was lonely, unhappily married, and he was working on a book. So I became his shadow. When I wrote my book, Servidio's Shadow, I became his assistant, his little guy, his gopher, his driver, his friend, up to a point. I could get things done. I was kind of useful, and he was very useful to me. I mean, useful in the way of introducing me to editors in London and so forth. And also questioning, if I was writing something, he could be very helpful. He was sort of my tutor, and my mentor, as people would say now. But he was also wrong about a lot of things. He was racist in a lot of respects. There are a lot of negative aspects to knowing him. But he was very instrumental in making me a writer. And meeting him was a very important part of my writing career, I suppose you could say. It would have happened anyway, but knowing him was very helpful to me. It's taken me a long time to understand how wrong he was about things, how mistaken he was, and how he really had a condition, a neurological, a mental condition that prevented him from being the person that he wanted to be. I mean, he was mad about money. He was frustrated with women. He had all sorts of issues that I didn't have. He always saw me as a lucky person, a person who was better adjusted, let's say, than he was. And I think he kind of envied that. He also envied the fact that very early in my writing life, I had two great successes, the Great Railway Bazaar and the Mosquito Coast. And I realized later that when I read his biography, that these were periods of his life when his work was not going well. And he wasn't getting big advances. He was having difficulties with publishers at a time when I was having great success with publishers. So there was a kind of envy, too, in what he was doing. But he was, a very important man in my life. Very complicated person. Much more complicated than he was made out to be. The biography is very good by the late Patrick French.
You've said that once you committed to writing as a profession, that it was fairly straightforward to make a living from it and get by. I found a quote from you where you said, "I can easily relate to Orwell's life as a poorly writer, publishing novels, essays, travel pieces, somewhat sneered at or dishonestly envied by academics and struggling to make a living, occasionally having a success, but always feeling slightly behind the eight ball." So how does that fit in? Was it in the 1970s with the Great Railway Bazaar that things kind of exploded for you and became much easier, or did you find that with a piecemeal approach from the outset that you could make a living from writing?
The Great Railway Bazaar was a very helpful book because it was successful. I made money, and it was. But even so, I thought, I was living in London as an alien, and my taxes in the 1970s were 83% on marginal amounts. Can you imagine paying 83%? So you're earning up to about £10,000 or £15,000, and then every bit after that is taxed at 83%. So you earn £100, and you have to pay £83 in tax, and you're left with £17. That was a period when a lot of people left London. I couldn't leave. My kids were in school. I had a wife, children, and mortgage. I couldn't leave. So I felt behind the eight ball because I was heavily taxed. Absurdly so. I mentioned it on television once and got a lot of stick for it. People say, how, you mentioned, well, yeah. So I felt insecure. I was an alien. I didn't have a work permit, really. So I couldn't actually get a proper job. I didn't want a job, actually. But I always felt somewhat insecure. All freelance writers feel insecure. Orwell did. Orwell said at one point in his life, I've always felt, although I worked every day and I worked very hard, I always felt that I could have done more, that I needed to do more. I felt that. Sometimes I feel it even now. I feel, like maybe I should be doing something that I'm not doing. The tension of a writer who doesn't have a job. I never got a Genius Grant or a Guggenheim Fellowship or any kind of fellowship or grant that would pave the way. I applied for them. I didn't get them. I don't know why I didn't get them. I deserved them, I felt. So that was always an issue for me. So you write a book, and I didn't get advances on my books. I wrote a book, gave it to the publisher gave me money for it, and then, an advance on royalties. Then the book came out. Then I would work on another book, then I gave it. It's different now. I work contract to contract now, book contracts. But in the 70s, no. So the wicked Margaret Thatcher took over. Taxes were lowered. Things were a bit better then. But the idea of having to make a living as a writer, I figured out by saying to myself, I'm not making a lot of money, but I know that if I publish a book every year and never turn any work down, if someone asks me, write 500 words about your favorite piece of luggage, okay, I'll do it. Review this book, fine, send it in. Any reasonable offer, even unreasonable offers, I took it.
What unreasonable offers did you accept? I would say review your favorite piece of luggage is quite a tall order, but maybe not.
No, it's pretty unreasonable because I didn't have a favorite. I had to invent it. So that's pretty unreasonable. Unreasonable would be reviewing a book I hated, taking time away from writing my book, the book I adored, to read an inferior book. I mean, that's torture. It's torture. It's awful. And you can't really put the boot in. You know that the person slaved over the book, so you've got to be fair about the book. But I think book reviewing was very difficult. But I did it because I want my books reviewed. I felt a sense of duty about it. I'm trying to think of unreasonable offers, though. One unreasonable offer I turned down. One was a woman said, she worked for the Philippine government, and she said, we're going to give you a free trip to Manila in the Philippines to write about Ferdinand Marcos and the new Philippines. And I thought, there's something I don't want to do. So I didn't do it. But that was an unreasonable offer.
We also enjoyed the story you wrote about selling your car in the middle of the 1970s and then spending almost the entire proceeds of the sale on one lunch with a woman who was not your wife, I think.
A lunch with a very attractive woman. lunch with a very attractive, very talented woman whose name I changed. She actually exists. But at the beginning of that essay, there's about how poorly paid writers were. I mean, I wrote a book called St. Jack. It was later made into a movie. Good movie, I think. And it sold pretty well. My advance on royalties for that was £250. After that, the publisher, that publisher was the Bodley Head. I submitted a book to him called The Black House, and he said, we think this book is going to hurt your reputation. I said, why? I don't have a reputation. And I said, and anyway, you were going to offer me £300 for it. He said, we can't do it. Anyway, I changed publishers, but he turned the book down. The book about the story about selling my car is funny. It actually happened. I sold my car. We went to, I said to this woman who was interested in food, would you like to go to a restaurant? She said, I love Boulston's. I think it still exists. And I had the money in my pocket. £60, I think, pound notes, blue £5 notes. I had them tucked in my pocket. And then nothing came of it. I mean, we had the meal. It was a great meal. I kissed her in the taxi, and that was it. I never saw her again. Well, those things happen. If you're a on-the-make young man, these unfortunate things happen. And what do you get out of it? A great piece for the London Review of Books. A funny piece, I think.
Could you tell us about the Great Railway Bazaar, about how it came about, but also what was going on with travel writing as a kind of genre at that time, and maybe your view on how the genre has developed since?
Travel writing at that time was pretty awful. I mean, it was, my wife and I went to a place, or it was political, or it was sightseeing, or it was, I don't know, something for the National Geographic. We got sick. Oh, we had amoebic dysentery. It was terrible. Or Abdul, our camel driver, was so sweet. Anyway, I thought, I'm going to write a book that doesn't have any of these things in it. No wife, no sightseeing, no charming natives. It's just going to be annoying people, strange food, strange situations, and then the books that I was reading, and it was going to be continuous. It was going to be fun. So I was going to leave London on a train to Folkestone, take the ferry, go to Paris, go to Istanbul, go to Tehran, go to Meshed, the holy city of fanatics, take a bus through Afghanistan, go to Pakistan, bumpity, 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 take this train, take that. No one had ever done it. And afterwards people said, gee, that was a great idea. How did you think of it? I was thinking, what's the easiest way to get to Afghanistan or India? Get a train, go to Victoria State. I was in Catford. Get the train to Catford, go to Victoria, go to Folkestone, just change trains. How about that? And no museum. And then don't go to churches, don't go to museums. Don't do any sightseeing. Don't see the Taj Mahal. But instead, talk to people. Listen to their stories. And so, simple enough. So I did it. Then I got to, I was in Vietnam when the war was on. I got to Tokyo, up and down Japan, great trains. Then I took a ferry to Nakhodka near Vladivostok and took the Trans-Siberian back to Moscow. Terrible trip, actually. And then came back. I had PTSD. It was so awful. I had been away 4.5 months. My life was in absolute ruins. When I got back. I had stayed away too long, everything was wrong when I went back. So I came back in a very deranged state of mind to a very unhappy household. And I thought, I got to write a book. And how do you get yourself out of this mental condition? You write a funny book. I turned it all to humor. I thought, well, I got to get something. I had spent all the money. I was in a very perilous situation financially and from all way, emotionally, and all. I was in a very, very bad way. And so I wrote the book, but I wrote the book, on my nerves. I didn't know what it would be, but I was writing the anti-travel book, the book that no one has written, with a lot of dialogue. I got that from Trollope. Anthony Trollope wrote a book called The West Indies and the Spanish Main. It's all about funny people, meeting people, and also dialogue. Plenty, because Trollope, of course, was a great novelist. And I had written lots and lots of dialogue and heard stories. So that's what kind of lifted it, kind of humanized the book, the novelistic element. I guess I made the places more human, more relatable. I don't know what I think of the book now. I think I've written better books since. I mean, Dark Star Safari, my book about Africa, is much better. My book about China, Riding the Iron Rooster, is better. But there you go. You know, you learn, you live and learn, they change. But that changed my fortunes, and it made me think two things. One is, I've got a living. It was a proper bestseller. I mean, it sold 1 million copies. It's probably more than 1 million copies, so that's pretty good, right? The other thing that I learned from that is I can do it again. If I have a free 6 months or a year, I'll go someplace. I'll go to South America. I'll go to China. I'll go to the Pacific. I'll go to Africa. I'll do it again. I can do that. All you do is you go to the place, you travel, you always take notes, ring a bell. And I took meticulous notes, and I thought, I'll come back, and I've got a book. There's my book. 5 notebooks, 6 notebooks. When I went in the Pacific, I remember I had a stack of about 12 notebooks with illustrations in them and everything. Took them back, all written in longhand, and, open a notebook and then type the book. Leave this out, put this in, elaborate on this, embroider on that. And it worked. I had great confidence from that. The idea that I could do something that I had never done before. When I lived in Africa, I never wrote travel pieces. So I lived there for 6 years, and I never wrote a travel piece, a so-called travel. I never was tempted to write a travel book. I thought a travel book is a concentrated period of experience. You can't summarize 6 years in a book. People did. I mean, people that I knew at Makerere and in Kenya and elsewhere wrote books about their experiences there. Well, they weren't very good books. They were just sort of episodic books about, an unforgettable person or something that happened. But there was no thread. There was no drama to it. But a travel book is a kind of balancing act. You're alone. Things are happening to you. Things go wrong. Problems come up. You solve the problem. In a way, that's what travel is, solving problems. And you put it in a book. So the book's, it lives by that. And I thought, I'll do it again. And I did it again. I've written a dozen travel books. So I guess it worked, right?
What was the response of your family, particularly with The Great Railway Bazaar, but also with subsequent books? You've touched on it a little bit, but I think I worked out that one of your sons was 3 when you went off for 4.5 months to write that book. How did your family respond to the reporting demands of those books?
Well, I mean, it was very difficult. I was away too long, as I say, I came back. I don't want to go into detail, but I came back to an unhappy family, put it that way. I mean, my kids are well known now as making Louis, Marcel. They make documentaries, they write books. They could probably tell you about it. But that's my immediate family. My family, my brothers, my sisters, my parents, were very conflicted about my work. And I realized now I became a writer to get away from them. And so subsequently I wrote a book called Motherland about my family. They didn't like that. A writer's family is always something of an issue because a writer, typically he or she is in a room alone, remote from the family. And if it's a serious writer, if you're a serious writer, you can't be disturbed. So you're removed from the family. And it's very difficult for a family to cope with that kind of thing. You're not going off to work. Most people say, well, I'm going to work, bye, and they close the door and they go and they're away for 8 hours or more, 12 hours maybe. That's with my experience. They go away. But you have nowhere to go. So you're going upstairs, I'm going to work. But you're intruded upon or interrupted and so forth. So it makes life, it's very difficult to be a writer and live in a house. So I've always tried to write in a different place. In London, I worked in a house, but on the top floor of a house. And then later I got a flat in Vauxhall and I worked there just to be away so that I could have privacy. So the privacy aspect was always an issue. It still is. Interruption, not only by the family, but interruptions by everyone. I've never found that the social aspect easy. I've never found writing difficult. I found living difficult. The person that has to do the living, to get a driver's license, to pay the taxes, to empty the garbage, to do the dishes, to cook, to take kids to school. That's the difficult part. The actual sitting and doing the writing, that's a breeze.
And on this thing of the interaction of the writer's life and the family life, what was your experience when your ex-wife wrote about the breakdown of your marriage? What was it like to be on the other end, as it were?
Yeah, I've been asked this question a few times. At first, I didn't read the book. Then I read it, and I thought, there's so many inaccuracies. It's a diary, I tried to... I'll tell you what I did. I annotated the book, and I put it in my archive, So my books, my papers and my books and so forth are in an archive in the Huntington Library in Los Angeles. So I wasn't on the receiving end really, because the book was so negligible. It's a very thin diary, and I just took pleasure in the bad reviews that it got. So, and I'll leave it at that. There's nothing to discuss in it really. It was. I don't know whether have you read it?
No.
I don't recommend it. You won't learn much from it. But there you go. There it is. And I just thought, that's not a book. It's not a book. Not a book. No one's really written about me in a way that I find, in any penetrating way. There's no biography of me. I don't want anyone to write a biography. I'd like to frustrate a biographer. Orwell said, don't write a biography about me. He frustrated, but his widow then allowed someone to write a biography. And now there's about 7 or 8 biographies. I've read most of the biographies, but Orwell didn't want one. He did not want one. Kipling didn't want one. You can understand why. I've used most of my life in my work. If you want to know about my life, read my many books. Virtually everything interesting that has happened to me, and even some boring things, I've put in my work. Even if I wrote an autobiography, it would be pretty tedious. It would be rehashing a lot of things that I've written about already. Kipling called biography the higher cannibalism, and I'd sort of go along with that.
We're coming towards the end of our time, so as a final question from me, a question we put to all novelists on the show is whether they're a plotter or a plunger, someone who works out the outline of their novel before they start writing, or whether they just dive in and see what happens on the page. Where do you sit along that spectrum?
No, I don't see what happens. I have a pretty good idea of what the book is about, and before I start. It may not be the final book, but I need to start with something more than just a character or just a situation. I need to know, where is this going? What it's about? Why? And that was a piece of advice that Naipaul gave me. Why are you writing this book? Why? He said, if you don't know why you're writing this book, you're not a writer. You need to know why. And he said that to me. He read my first, why are you writing this? I told him. When I met him, I had different ideas. I had different literary heroes, let's say. Naipaul was not one of them. But yes, I need more than that. I need a structure. I need an outline. Not a big outline, but I need to know what it is. For example, with the Mosquito Coast, I thought it's about a family who leaves. They want to leave the United States. The father is an inventor. They're going to Central America, Honduras. The man has the idea of building an ice machine. After that, I didn't know what would happen. I didn't know who they'd meet, or I kind of imagined, as I was writing it, the people they met, the situations and so forth. But I knew that it was a man, it was a family, he was an inventor, the ice machine, and he thought that ice is the secret of civilization. So you got that, that's pretty good. You can go pretty far with that. But the rest of the time, what happens there, threatened by locals, making friends with locals, and then the man sort of losing his mind, all that came later. But that's the sort of thing you discover in the process of writing. But I couldn't just start, oh, here's this man with a funny idea. It's not enough for me.
Final question for me is, could you tell us about your reconciliation with V.S. Naipaul? We saw that it was Ian McEwan sitting next to you in a tent at the Hay Festival who said life is short, and that was your impetus to go up and talk to him again. What was that experience like?
First, let me say I'm really impressed by the amount that you've read about me and my stuff. Normally I talk to people who don't have a clue. They say, talk to me about this, and they don't really know what they're asking. But you've done quite a lot of homework, and God bless you for that. Because people tend not to, and it's not that testing, it's all on the internet. All you have to do is read it, I guess. But you've done it, so thank you for that. What happened was, I was at the Hay Festival, and things had ended very badly with Naipaul on the Gloucester Road. So the last words were him. I said, so what are we going? What's the story? And I thought I had written him a letter and facts and so forth. And I said, where is this going?
Was that after you'd published your book on it?
No,
Before?
it was before, because the book was a result of that. And I said, what? And it was like tough luck. He said, actual words were, take it on the chin and move on. And he walked away. And I thought, oh my God, I was with my son, Marcel. And he said, Dad. I said, that was terrible. We walked. And then I thought, well, this is over. This friendship, because I didn't know at that point where he was with it. And I thought, Jesus, I guess he really has rejected me. But then I thought, I'm free. It's like, you lose a job. I can write about it. I haven't signed a non-disclosure agreement. I can write about all this crazy, insane experience that I've had with him. What a complete wally he is. How a great writer, but also a difficult women, drinking, womanizing, prostitutes, all these things that he told me about. I can be as indiscreet as I thought that was the day I thought I'm going to write the book. So I wrote Servidio's Shadow, and then he read it. I don't know whether he read it or not, but anyway, I got a message saying, we hate your book. The book was such a revelation to me. I still like the book. If anyone wants to find out what's it like to be a writer, read that book. What's it like to experience Naipaul? Not just that, but make your way in the world. Find a publisher, get rejected by a publisher, write a bestseller, make a movie, have a love affair. All of that, it's all in the book. And also Naipaul's a great character. Whatever he is, difficult person, complete pain in the arse, great character. So I'm at the Hay Festival, and I see Ian McEwan, and Ian McEwan said, Naipaul's here. I said, really? He said, and there he is. Naipaul coming through the door, limping on the arm of his wife and his stepdaughter, coming through, dragging himself through the door. Ian says, you should talk to him. I said, are you nuts? Are you crazy? He'll freak out. Because one time Naipaul was on a plane, and someone told him he was taking his shirt off, and he totally freaked out. And he said, you're all a bunch of, and he used an unprintable word, a word that will get you off the internet. It begins with C. You're also a bunch of C. And the flight attendant stepped back, and she thought, here's this insane West Indian screaming abuse at me. So, I knew what he was, and I've seen him freak out at restaurants. I mean, totally freak out with a waiter. How dare you? Or saying to a waiter, I think you look like me. I think you look like me. Well, that's nuts. So there's a side of Naipaul that's insane. So going up to him, so Ian says, go talk to him. I'm thinking, talk, and then light the fuse. But then he said, life's too short. You should really say something. So Naipaul at that point was limping, looking frail. And I thought, well, okay, life's too short. I'll go up. So I went up and I said, Vidya. And he looked at me, didn't recognize me. And I said, Paul. And he said, Paul. And he grabbed my hand. And I said, I've missed you. I have missed you. And he said, I've missed you too. Big moment. But, he's tearful. his wife is standing aside. His wife had written me a kind of abusive letter. She's standing there astonished. Then a photographer came up and took our picture. And I thought, this is amazing. You know, my heart beating. Oh, be still, my beating heart. And I thought, this is incredible. And then so I said, do you want to have a cup of coffee? He said, yeah, sure. We sat down, we had a cup of coffee. What have we been doing? His wife then softened. She said, how are you, Paul? I said, I'm fine. You know, I had a book. Blah-de-blah. We talked. And from that moment, I was friendly with his wife. My wife and she became sisters. I became a pal once again. And this is amazing because one of Naipaul's rules was never give anyone a second chance. Never in life. Someone lets you down, they're out. They're out. No second chances. To women, to waiters, to people who work for you, they let you down, they screw you, they're going to do it again. Don't. And here's Naipaul breaking one of his rules, one of his life rules, giving me a second chance. So from that, that was 2011, and I was friendly with him and saw him often. And on his deathbed, when he was dying in the hospital in Kensington, I was there for my son's birthday, my oldest son's birthday, and I went and visited him and held his hand. We took a picture, and he was there dying. So, you know, that's pretty amazing. Thanks to Ian McEwan with a key thing. Life's too short. And I thought, you know, that was a big deal for me. It was very helpful. And then from that moment, then I understood him a bit better too from that. So I wrote an epilogue to my book, Servidia's Shadow. The paperback has a postscript and an epilogue. And I put that in, how uplifting it was, how wonderful it is, how wonderful, you know, forgiveness, I guess you could say, compassion, all the emotions and traits that he never had, but at the end of his life he had it. Had compassion, forgiveness, second chances, fine, you know, so that was great.
Well, that feels like a fitting note to end on. So wishing you all the very best with Burma Saab and with all your projects going forward. By the time we release this, you may well have written another novel.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Paul Theroux. He's on Twitter at @PaulTheroux_. He's on Instagram at paul.theroux. His website is paultheroux.com, and Burma Saab is published by Hamish Hamilton. Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your takeaway from the interview with Paul?
I really enjoyed talking to Paul. I thought he was a lively and witty guest, and we both remarked off air how jealous we were of his office, which seemed to be a delightful spot in Hawaii. And in particular, I enjoyed talking to him about the kind of current Orwell craze and how he sort of saw parts of his own biography in him, and how he then sort of fictionalized that, but drew on his own experience in a way that would be resonant. And it was great to hear his thoughts on the genre of travel writing as well. How about you?
I was also impressed by his shirt, which I think was a genuine Hawaiian shirt. Obviously in the audio medium of a podcast, that will not be available for the listeners, but we enjoyed it. Yeah, I thought it was a great interview, and kind of interesting just to get someone talking about that, you know, he's an older man now, so to talk about the span of a literary career that has covered such a long time and taken in so many sort of twists and turns, and to have that kind of retrospective quality, but also someone who didn't appear to have kind of lost his enthusiasm for the craft. And I was particularly interested to hear him talk about his relationship with V.S. Naipaul, and I've heard that book of his on that relationship is really excellent, both for its specifics, but also as a kind of example of narrative of a young writer making their way in the world. So that's definitely on my list to read. Anyway, Rachel, what have you been up to?
I have been editing the culture section for the past couple of weeks, so that's kept me busy in a couple of short weeks. But that's it, really. I have been reading as much as I can and not really watching any television. I feel like I have a lot of television to catch up on. I've belatedly come to Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, a novel by Gabrielle Zevin, which I think has sold over 1 million copies, which I think is excellent. Kept me up last night actually reading because I didn't want to finish it. But how about you, Simon? What have you been up to?
I'm in the very final leg of my my book project in the Alps. So this ski mountaineering race that I'm doing is in just over a week's time. So really the final stretch for that. So I have to go and sleep in a mountain cabin to acclimatize and do our final bits of training. So I'm just very much looking forward to
finishing and getting that out of the way, hopefully finishing the race. And then in terms of reading, I've been reading a book by Geoffrey Winthrop Young. So this is connected to the project, but he was a mountaineer, but also a poet. And it's his autobiography called On High Hills, which is interesting, but he has this kind of slightly impenetrable Edwardian prose style, which I'm finding slightly hard work. So not making as rapid inroads with that as I was hoping. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes, on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.